Dead Cells is a game that just recently came out of early access, and what do you know, I was given a copy of the game. First time for everything. I've had a lot of fun playing it so far, so I thought I'd give my 2 cents on it. Bear in mind that this is coming from someone who didn't have to actually pay for the game. Firstly, it is in no way, shape, or form a Souls-like. It advertises, quote, Souls-light combat, not Souls-like, Souls-light, and action in the sense that it is, quote, tough but fair. But I think this is a pretty big stretch, which I don't really get. The game is great on its own, so the devs don't need to try and string a Souls comparison when it really isn't needed. I would never consider Dead Cells combat to be Souls-like, or Souls-light, or any other Souls-like word, but I'll get more into that once we actually understand what the game is. So let's explain what Dead Cells is. As the Steam page says, it's a roguelite Metroidvania. There's that word light again. Okay, maybe the devs just like the word light a lot. The core elements that define this game are the features that would qualify it to be a roguelike and those that would qualify it to be a Metroidvania. The devs have also opted to coin and use Roguevania as a descriptor. Get it, like roguelite and Metroidvania? Which I guess is apt, but makes me wonder how many game names and genres we can add into one word until we arrive at our own video game Ship of Theseus. In the past year or so, I've gotten to play some great games that would actually be really relevant in comparing to Dead Cells. Hollow Knight for the Metroidvania side, and Binding of Isaac and Enter the Gungeon for the Rogue side. I really enjoyed all of those games, and think that there are some great modern takes on their respective genres. I wouldn't be afraid to speak of Dead Cells in a similar breath as those games, so if you've played them, that should give you a picture of my attitude on Dead Cells going into this video. So let's break each side of this Roguevania down. In suit of Metroidvanias, each level in Dead Cells is like a labyrinth you explore and weave your way through. As you go, you may discover power-ups or dead ends or mini-bosses or anything in between. There is a constant need to backtrack, and sometimes areas and enemies will be different on the second go-around. Though the tediousness or meticulousness, depending on how you look at it, of traditional Metroidvania backtracking is not too present in Dead Cells because of the plethora of teleportation stations. You probably come across one every 10 seconds, and each one lets you teleport to any other one you've revealed, letting you move between the entire explored map relatively instantly. So it's not sticking to the Metroidvania formula completely, which makes sense. It's not a Metroidvania, it's a Roguevania. Now we're going to start treading into the rogue territory a bit. In Dead Cells, the gameplay is instanced out in runs. As you progress through the levels, if you die, you lose all your acquired weapons, power-ups, and currencies. In this case, the currencies are gold and cells. You're sent all the way back to the start and have to restart the whole run-through. If you're familiar with Binding of Isaac or Enter the Gungeon, then this concept of runs is just the same. And like those games, in each run you unlock and pick up items and power-ups that change your attacks and increase your damage or other stats. You can also unlock certain things that remain permanently unlocked, even across deaths, which alter gameplay. However, back to the Metroidvania land, these permanent unlocks are more significant than in traditional roguelites, in that they have much more broader consequences. They are things like giving you the ability to permanently access a new zone, heal multiple times instead of once or never, consistently find better gear and drops, and progress faster overall. And just to flesh out my description a bit, as you progress through the levels, you'll find new weapons, gadgets, and grenades that let you adopt a variety of different playstyles, especially when paired with choosing which of your 3 stats you want to level. Most of the weapons and gadgets do damage directly correlated with the level of your stats. Red weapons do higher damage the more the red skill is leveled, and the same goes with the other 2 colors. Each color also has a general focus. For example, red has a focus on higher damage, and green has a focus on higher sustainability, more HP and HP recovery. Now that we have a working idea of what constitutes this Roguevania known as Dead Cells, let's talk about gameplay and how this game is the Dark Souls of games that aren't like Dark Souls and shouldn't be compared to Dark Souls. First off, similarities. You have an invincible roll, you have limited heals that refill at checkpoints. Moving on to differences, you have no stamina bar, the game is 2D, you have no light or heavy attacks, there are no proper weapon upgrade trees, leveling is based on item pickups, not killing enemies, and the biggest one is that the combat is not slow and deliberate. It's really fast, and if I can say this without any negative connotation, it's spammy. When I'm hitting scrubs, I'm mashing my X and Y buttons as fast as I can. And I don't mean to say this is a bad thing, I really enjoy the fast pace. When I get into a good rhythm of slicing enemies and zipping through the map, the game shines brilliantly. Even the heavier, slower weapons still give themselves to a certain speed of progressing through the level, as you may only need to hit enemies once or twice, which means you can keep up the overall pace. This is at odds with the Souls mentality of slow and deliberate, as I mentioned before. I would describe running through the worlds of Lothric or Lordran as a fairly meticulous experience, and the combat of Souls games is such that you always have to be careful because one hit could lead to your demise. Dead Cells is all about keeping up pace. The game even rewards you generously for reaching upper levels in a short amount of time. This is a core difference in design philosophy that I think really demarcates Dead Cells as not a Souls-like in any significant way. If we look at other games that bear the colorful moniker of Souls-like, we'll see games like The Surge and Nioh, which fall much more on the side of the Souls series' slow and deliberate combat. And this isn't to say that you don't have to be careful in Dead Cells combat or that Dead Cells combat isn't high stakes. One hit can lead you to a pretty bad situation, but I think it's to a different level than Dark Souls because Dead Cells is supposed to be played at a faster speed. It simply doesn't play like a Souls game. It can be challenging, and my heart rate went through the roof the first time I vanquished the bosses, but that's just a mark of a game with satisfying combat, not a Souls-like or derivative. I really don't want to see reviews and websites talking about how this game shares attributes with Souls, even though I'm sure that they will, especially because the developers do. Another aspect of the gameplay that I want to talk about is the enemy telegraphing system. Because of the style of the game, most of the enemies have a very explicit telegraph right before they attack in the form of an exclamation mark popping up above them. I assume this is because most enemies don't occupy much of the screen space, so assuming that the player would actually be able to see the enemies' less obvious movement telegraphs would be putting too much on the player, especially when there are multiple enemies or a lot of particle effects going on. I understand why this would be done, as if players didn't have it, they could very well get mad that there isn't a quote fair way to know when each enemy is going to attack, even though most enemies do have an actual natural telegraph, generally in the form of winding up their attack in some way. Have purely natural telegraphs, though I don't know how plausible that would be in a game like this. It works well in the Souls games because the enemies in those games are much larger relative to the screen, so they're much easier to see. I would think I would be able to manage it in game without the extra exclamation mark, as a lot of the natural telegraphs are pretty decently shown. So it's a gripe, but it's not the biggest one. Now, the replayability of the game due to its roguelike run-based design is a pretty big plus to me. It's the same kind of thing as Binding of Isaac or Enter the Gungeon, where the game is based around repeatedly playing through the same levels. To make this not a boring slog, pickups and power-ups spawn differently, and each level is never the exact same. Ever infamous procedural generation is used to achieve this, but I think it's used really well in this case. You always know generally what a level is like after you've been through it, but you're never going to be running the exact same corridors or memorizing maps. To be fair, I haven't gotten to the late game yet, so I can't say how it completely holds up, but it seems like Dead Cells does a pretty good job of keeping high replayability, meaning many hours of content. On to some other aspects of the game, the aesthetics is high level notch. Visual design, graphics, sound design, and soundtracks are all done quite well. The atmospheres of each level are extremely distinct, and the art and music immediately make that a reality. Pixel art can sometimes be a hit or miss, with devs sometimes going really simplistic with the number of pixels and amount of detail. Dead Cells doesn't have an immense amount of detail, but it does have enough for it to not be a detriment. The layered design from foreground to double distance background makes traversing back and forth in each level feel dynamic and helps bring the world to life. The player design is unique compared to the world, so you stand out enough to always be decently sure of where you are. Though you don't take up that much of the screen, and with a couple enemies launching attacks at you, the effects can get pretty intense. There have been a few times where I felt like I lost where I was, but it hasn't been a major problem. The enemy designs are well varied. Coming across a new enemy feels like a surprise because they're generally unlike anything previously seen. The sounds are mostly good at doing their job, and the music always helps build the atmosphere. I don't have any strong opinion either way about the sounds, they're decent and fulfill what they need to do, but I do think the music was created and chosen intelligently. Because most of the levels are so distinct, they should have music that helps illustrate those distinctions, and it does. The seaside, almost jaunty tunes that accompany the pirate zombies of the Stilt Village are quite at odds with the percussion-heavy, driving soundtrack of the Ramparts, as they should be because those are completely different thematic zones. This again helps the world feel much more alive than it otherwise would have without these features. I should probably discuss the story too. It's there, but it's easy to miss. Most of the story is learning about the lore of the island that the game takes place on and the different zones. This is often done in loading screens before each zone. It's definitely a more minor feature in my opinion, but it does give context to a lot of the areas you explore and fight in, so it does help with the immersion and world building of it all, even if it's to a small extent. The player character seems to have a good sense of humor to him, her, it, that makes for some slightly comical interactions, which helps lift the mood in an often intense game. Overall, the game has character. You can tell there was a clear design that was faithfully executed, with the result being a unique and satisfying experience. I would give Dead Cells as a solid recommendation, especially to anyone who has played or enjoyed Metroidvanias or roguelikes. It's pretty easy to jump into, and it has a lot in terms of content and room to master the combat. Satisfying gameplay, coupled with a nice aesthetic package, makes Dead Cells a solid grab, even if it isn't a 2D Dark Souls.